Welcome to this next podcast in our CFO strategy series. Topic for discussion today is why strategy breaks and why CFOs end up holding the consequences. My name is Paul Hunter. Welcome. Most strategy failures don't announce themselves as bad ideas. They appear earlier as premature commitment, false certainty, or what looks like rigour, but functions more like theatre. Those patterns help explain something many organisations find deeply frustrating: why they so often appear to need crisis before they can change, even when disruption is already visible. Long before crisis arrives, something quieter has usually broken down. Not intent, nor intelligence, but the system through which judgment is formed, tested, and allowed to move the organisation forward. When that system misfires, the consequences don't distribute evenly across the organisation. They concentrate in very specific places, where ambiguity becomes commitment, where commitment becomes capital, and where capital binds future capacity. That is why finance feels this first and most persistently. Not because CFOs own strategy, they don't, but because CFOs are where judgment hardens into obligation. Once resources are authorised, strategy stops being an idea and becomes an institutional fact. Strategy failure is often described as a lack of foresight, insight, or analysis. Have you ever been asked, for example, can't you think more strategically? In reality, most large organisations today are saturated with intelligence. They have scenarios, dashboards, models and forecasts in abundance. The real failure is not foresight, it is judgment under pressure. As uncertainty rises, organisations instinctively accelerate mechanisms designed for stability. Accountability replaces responsibility. Dashboards replace judgment, and delivery replaces learning. These mechanisms give the appearance of control, but they also collapse ambiguity prematurely. Strategy breaks not because the future is unclear, but because executives feel pressured to act as if it were. From finance, the early signs are familiar. Option value collapses, commitments harden quickly, and flexibility disappears, become visible. Over the past decade, many infrastructure and any organisations recognised early that transition pressures would fundamentally reshape asset lives and cash flow profiles. The intelligence was not subtle, the direction was broadly understood. What delayed change was not ignorance, it was legitimacy. Large capital programs continued to be approved against legacy assumptions because pausing or re-examining them lacked an authorising moment. By the time regulatory or market shocks arrived, irreversibility had already been embedded. From finance, this shows up as stranded value risk, not because the future was misunderstood, but because commitment outran judgment. CFOs are often described as guardians of discipline or as enforcers of realism at the edge of strategic ambition. That framing is reassuring and fundamentally incomplete. It implies that CFOs can remain neutral observers of strategy. That direction is chosen elsewhere, and finance merely assesses feasibility or affordability after the fact. In practice, that separation does not exist. Once capital is committed, strategy ceases to be exploratory and becomes institutional constraint. Options narrow, architectures harden, future responses become path-dependent. This means there is no neutral position for the CFO, even in organisations where strategy is formally owned by another function. The CFO does not choose strategy, but the CFO decides when strategy becomes binding. That distinction is critical because there is a qualitative difference between discussing possibilities and authorising commitments that foreclose alternatives. Once resources are authorised, strategic direction acquires legitimacy through obligation. It becomes expensive, financially, politically, reputationally, to revisit. This is why CFOs experience the consequences of strategic breakdown earlier than most. They encounter it when flexibility disappears faster than expected, when contingencies evaporate quietly, and when assumptions can no longer be inspected without destabilising the organisation. At that point, strategy has not simply gone wrong, it has become unjudgeable. By way of example, in large mergers, strategic rationales are usually validated before integration decisions irrevocably harden. But CFOs see something else: systems unified early, synergies locked in, integration economics frozen before learning has occurred. When assumptions later soften, the organisation cannot simply unwind decisions. The failure did not occur at deal approval. It occurred when commitment outran judgment. Neutrality did not prevent this outcome. Neutrality enabled it. That is why the CFO's real responsibility is not to approve or reject strategy, but to ensure that strategy is judgeable before it becomes irreversible. One of the most dangerous assumptions in modern strategy is that the future is a problem to be solved. It isn't. The future is something organisations must remain responsive to before it clarifies. This is what we mean by pro-responsive thinking, not prediction, not forecasting, but the disciplined capacity to hold multiple futures open, delay irreversible commitment, and rehearse consequences before action hardens into fact. Ironically, many risk management tools designed to help leadership act responsibly do the opposite. Forecasts and scenarios compress uncertainty into numbers, and numbers create pressure to decide. From finance, this pressure is acute. Every capital decision is a wager on a future that cannot be known. The question is not whether the wager proves correct, it is whether it was judged responsibly at the moment it became binding. In banking and insurance, automation and AI initiatives are often justified through clear efficiency narratives. Early pilots show savings, business cases close, rollouts accelerate. What is often missed is that early automation choices also hardcode operating models, risk assumptions, and customer propositions. By the time second-order effects appear, flexibility has already been consumed. CFOs recognise this when architectural lock-in accelerates faster than learning, and optionality disappears before benefits materialise. Strategy rarely fails loudly. It fails cognitively. It fails when assumptions stop being inspected, narratives hardened into facts, and dissent is reclassified as misalignment. These are not individual leadership failures. They are systemic cognitive breakdowns, often reinforced by governance mechanisms designed for alignment rather than judgment. Capital approval processes are a common example. Projects that express uncertainty struggle to progress. Projects that present confidence, even when manufactured, move faster. Over time, the system selects for decisiveness rather than judgment. From the CFO's perspective, cognitive failure appears as overconfidence in numbers, collapsing option value, and defensiveness around commitment. At that point, the CFO's role is not to say no, it is to insist that judgment has not yet finished. Even when judgment is renewed, many organisations still stall. So why? Because strategy change without organisational change simply rewrites language. Renewal must be understood as a cycle, reframing, restructuring, revitalisation, and ultimately regeneration. Regeneration is not an outcome at the end of transformation, It is a strategic orientation that prevents transformation itself from becoming value destruction. CFOs do not run this cycle, but without CFO-anchored legitimacy, pricing and consequence awareness, the cycle collapses into activity rather than renewal. So to wrap up, this is why CFOs end up holding the consequences of strategy failure, even when they did not own strategy. Not because finance is conservative, but because finance is where judgment becomes obligation. The strategic question organisations now face is not whether strategy is sophisticated, but whether the conditions for judging strategy were ever present. In the next episode, we'll go deeper by reconstructing what strategy actually is, once planning can no longer act as its proxy. Judgment under irreducible uncertainty. This is where renewal becomes possible or fails silently.